Today's webinar is going to cover the extra cost feature of expense reimbursement. And before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. All of your phones are muted. So when you have a question, you're going to want to enter that question in the chat window. You don't have to wait until the end of the webinar. You can ask those questions right away. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel as well as the ClubExpress Cool Stuff page within a couple of days. All of our webinars are available on our Cool Stuff page. So when you go to clubexpress.com, click Cool Stuff in the menu, click on webinars on the side panel, and you're not only able to see our upcoming webinar schedule, but you can also see a list of recently recorded webinars that we have hosted. A new addition to our website is a calendar. So within the ClubExpress calendar, you can see all of the upcoming webinars that we have scheduled, and you're also able to register for those webinars. So you don't have to register currently. Normally, you get an email as an administrator letting you know that there is a webinar happening in a few days. But a couple of the benefits to registering for the webinar in advance, there are some handouts and documents that are available when you register for the webinar, just some useful guides to help you use some of the features that we're going to talk about in the webinars. And there is a portion of registration that allows you to ask questions in advance of the webinar. When you register for the webinar, if it's a topic that you already have questions about and it's something that you'd like to see demonstrated in the webinar, feel free to enter that as a response when you're registering. That way we can tailor the webinar to fit exactly what our viewers are looking for. And of course, our video tutorials are also available on the Cool Stuff page of our website. When you select Cool Stuff and then select video tutorials, our tutorials are generally shorter. And of course, you can find all of that great video content on our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is accessible by searching for clubexpress.com. That's DOTCOM on YouTube. Make sure that when you visit our YouTube channel, you hit that subscribe button and the bell so that you receive notifications whenever we post new tutorials or new webinars. And as I mentioned, if you are currently using ClubExpress, and particularly if you are enjoying using ClubExpress, we would absolutely love to hear from you. You have a handful of options for leaving us a review if you go to clubexpress.com/reviews to help other potential ClubExpress users figure out if ClubExpress is right for them. Today, we're going to talk about expense reimbursements. So expense reimbursements is an extra cost module that's available to add to your website. The cost currently is $600. It's a one-time fee that you will pay and have access to expense reimbursements on your site. The expense reimbursements module is used to allow members to request reimbursement for various club and association expenses through your own website so that they don't have to go to an external product in order to request those reimbursements from you. These requests by nature are going to be linked to events, which we call projects. But if you're thinking of using expense reimbursements for items that aren't linked to an event, stay tuned because we do have a few tips for you. Members request reimbursements through their member profile, and the expenses go through an approval process by your organization that you set, and we'll have a couple of tips for some best practices that you can implement as well. Then you reimburse the member either by check or to their member account. So in today's demonstration, we're going to go through a handful of things. We're going to look at both the admin and the user side of the module today. So the admin side is where you're going to set up the module. You're going to configure your reimbursement categories, and it's also where you're going to approve and deny any reimbursement requests that have been submitted by your members. The user side is obviously where your members are going to submit your requests. So the first thing that we're going to look at today is the setup of the module. We're going to, of course, categorize our expense types. We are going to take a look at events and how they link to expenses and talk about a couple of best practice tips that you can use internally when you are using expense reimbursements. Today, we're going to be demoing expense reimbursements on a different demo club. It's our Demo Club Pro. This is our faux financial planning association. I'm logged into the Chicago Association of Financial Planners as Martin Smith. Martin Smith is an administrator. To access expense reimbursements, once it has been enabled on your website, I will select Control Panel. And in the Money tab, under Website Modules, I can select Expense Reimbursements. So when we take a look at our expense reimbursement admin screen, and you are setting up expense reimbursements for the first time, what you're going to want to do is set up categories. So if you've used any module on the ClubExpress site, you are familiar with our love for categories. They're how you're going to organize your expenses and how your members are going to categorize their requests. So as an admin, you can search by category, and as a user, you'll select the category that applies to your expense. So let's take a look at the categories that we have configured so far. When I'm looking at my reimbursement category administration screen, I have the ability to add a category. And when I'm adding a category, all I'm doing is naming that category and entering in the sequence that I want it to appear in the drop-down menu that my users are going to see when they are adding expenses. So we have a handful of categories that we have set up, and these are just categories that are going to apply to the expense types that you've created. Now, these are categories that are specific to a professional association, but you may have other categories that you might want to add as well. So let's go ahead and add an equipment category. I will save my changes. And now I see that that additional category is already available in my list of categories, and it is also instantly available to your members when they're adding their expense reimbursement requests. When I'm looking at categories, I see that most of them just have an edit icon, and that last category that I added also has a delete icon. The edit option allows me to change the name of that category as well as the sequence so that I can change the order in which those categories are going to appear for me. The delete icon is only going to appear for categories which do not have any expenses currently associated with them. So if that category is being used currently to define an expense, you will not be able to delete that category. But again, equipment was just added. We haven't had any expenses associated with that particular category yet, so we do have the option to remove it. Once you've set up categories, your members will be able to begin submitting those expenses. So what I'm going to do now is take a little bit of a detour and show you what this is going to look like from a member's perspective. When I'm in Expense Reimbursements Administration, which we'll go over in detail in a moment, this is where I'm essentially looking at all of the expenses that my members have submitted. So let's take a look at how they get there. So I have just opened up a new window, and I am going to log in as Colleen Carter. Colleen Carter is just a regular member of this financial planning association. She does a lot of work for them, and so she has a lot of expenses that she needs to submit. So Colleen is going to hover over her name at the top right-hand corner of your site, and she is going to navigate to her member profile. The member profile is where your members are going to be able to submit their expense reimbursement requests. Under histories, once you've enabled expense reimbursements, the link will appear as an option within their histories in their member profile. So I'll select expense reimbursements. I can view the history of all of the reimbursements that I've requested. I can view the date that the expense was submitted, the title that I gave that particular expense when I uploaded it as a member. If your organization has subgroups, you'll be able to see the subgroup that that particular expense applied to. So if I was looking to be reimbursed for something that I purchased for the organization as a whole versus something that I may have purchased to use within just my chapter. Next up, the status, and we will talk about all of the different expense statuses that you might see in just a moment. The amount that the member requested and the amount that was approved by the organization. So those can be two separate amounts. Of course, the member might request to be reimbursed for a whole host of things, but you as the administrators have the final say, and you might decide that there are a handful of things that you choose not to reimburse for. And finally, in the maintain column, the members can view their previous expense reimbursement requests. So let's go back one screen. And at the very top, I am going to select Add Reimbursement Request. And this is the screen where I, as a member, am going to be able to put in all of the information associated with my particular expense reimbursement. So at the very top, I am going to enter in the title of my expense reimbursement request. And Colleen purchased a veggie tray for the committee meeting that was hosted a couple of months ago. Next up, again, if your organization has subgroups, you'll be able to select the subgroup. And if not, you'll just select your top level of your organization. And this next line is the project that this expense is associated with. So I mentioned at the top of the webinar that expense reimbursements by design are going to be associated with an event that you may have hosted. Now, if you are using expenses to reimburse folks for things that they're purchasing for events, that's totally fine. But you might have expenses that aren't necessarily associated with an event. So let's talk about both of those instances. In this case, Colleen's expense does actually apply to an event that was hosted. So under project, I am going to select my event and choose the meeting from the list of events that have been hosted. Now, these events only go back about 3 months. So as an internal best practice, you might want to stress to your members that there might be a time limit on, how far back they're able to request that reimbursement for. I know a lot of companies in general usually say that they want expenses submitted within maybe a couple of weeks of actually incurring that expense. So you can set your own internal best practices, but just note that, pulling information from older meetings or older events isn't something that can be selected from this particular window. So another option that we have is just simply entering in the project. So if I completely delete the event option that I have, I can enter in the project name. Now, this opens you up to a couple of different things. If you have multiple people who are submitting expenses for the same project and you want to make sure perhaps that the naming of the project is consistent or that you're able to categorize those expenses in the right way, you can do a couple of different things. You can create an expense category for a specific project. Maybe your organization is revamping a lot of its marketing materials, and you can create a category called 2021 Marketing Revamp. That way, whenever a member goes into their expense reimbursement options, they can choose that category to apply to all of their expenses. That way, all of those items are easily searchable for you, and your members can use that consistent tag to apply to all of their expense reimbursements. Another option that you have is creating an event that you're not using for registration, that you're not using for anything related to actually hosting an event. You're simply using it as a placeholder. So if I scroll through my list of events, and again, I have past events and I also have a handful of future events as well, all the way at the bottom of my list, I've created an event within my event calendar to act as sort of a catch-all for some of my expenses. And again, this is just allowing me to sort of categorize these items. And when we go back and we look at our expense reimbursement screen, you'll see how some of these tips that I'm giving you will apply and make it easier for you as administrators to locate and find and organize all of these expenses. So again, I've created an event and I have titled the event For Expenses Only, Do Not Copy, Do Not Use. And I've created the date for the event as several years into the future. So this event will always appear at the very bottom of my project list. And I can select that item and apply it to that particular expense. And again, it's just another way that you can allow your members to properly categorize some of their expenses. You can, of course, allow them to type in a project name. Or you can, again, allow them to categorize their expenses based on the project or create an event that takes place well into the future to act as a catch-all. Now, let's go ahead and select that original monthly meeting because that was actually the meeting that this veggie tray was purchased for. Now, all of the additional information that you are seeing is pulling from the member profile of the person who is submitting the request. This applies for both regular memberships and business memberships. The business contact information is going to be inserted the same way the member's contact information is inserted. And of course, all of this can be backed out. So if the check that is going to be paid out to the member needs to be payable to a different party, or there's some more information that you need that's different from the contact information that's being inserted in the member profile, the member always has the ability to edit that. In the next section, you'll actually start inputting some information related to the expense. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll select the date that the expense was incurred. This could be a date that you determine within your own organization. As your best practice, you could say that you want the date to be the date that the charge was incurred. Maybe you want the date that the event was hosted. It's entirely up to you. We'll enter in our vendor information. Again, these are just open text fields that the members are filling in. Colleen Carter got this from the General Grocers, and she purchased a veggie tray for the committee meeting. Next up, she'll categorize her expense. So these are all of the categories that we were looking at originally and we had configured as administrators. I am going to select the conferences and conventions category. Now, the great news is that even if the expenses aren't categorized properly, as an administrator, you always have the ability to fix that. You can, of course, reject the request and ask that Colleen recategorize the expense. So Colleen is going to choose the best category that applies to her expense, and she'll enter in the amount that she paid and select Add. Now, Colleen has the ability to add multiple items to the same expense reimbursement request. She can continue to add as many line items as she needs. So, for example, if she purchased a veggie tray from the General Grocers, but she purchased sandwiches from a sandwich shop down the road, she might want to enter separate line items for both. She can always save this particular request and add a completely new request for her additional expenses. Each expense line item can be categorized differently, but they are all going to fall under the same project that Colleen added at the very top of our screen here. So let's say that Colleen is done for now. She can always go back and edit these individual line items. She can delete the line item if she feels she's made a mistake. And finally, she can add some supporting documentation. So your supporting documentation, of course, are probably just going to be receipts. At the very top, I can title my supporting documentation. I'm going to simply browse and add my receipt that I used for my purchase. And we'll just call this receipt. I'll go ahead and save my changes. And now I can see that my supporting document has been uploaded. And in the same way that you can add multiple line items for the same expense, you can add multiple receipts as well. At the very top right-hand corner, we also see some notes. So this would be a section of notes where members can add information in addition to their line item and their receipts. So perhaps you want to note maybe Colleen had a conversation with Martin Smith, who's the administrator, and Martin approved the expense preemptively. In addition to that, she could also maybe attach the email where Martin approved that expense and add it in the notes as well. Now, these notes are going to be visible for administrators when they go in and actually approve that expense reimbursement. So we'll go ahead and say, Martin approved this expense on 5/1/2021. So Colleen is just giving her expense reimbursement one last look. And at the very bottom, she has the option to save the expense reimbursement and come back to it later if maybe she's looking for extra receipts, or submit the expense reimbursement as it stands. So we're going to go ahead and submit the reimbursement. And now let's take a look at what we're seeing here. We see our list of expense reimbursements that Colleen had submitted previously. Some of them have been paid. Some of them have been approved, but not yet paid. And we'll talk about these statuses in just a moment. And at the very bottom, we see our final expense that we have submitted for our veggie tray. Let's take a look back on that administration screen. We're logged in again as Martin Smith. Now, Martin Smith is taking a look at expense reimbursements. And at the very top of our expense reimbursement admin screen, our default search options are set to show the previous 3 months of expense reimbursement requests. We can always edit these, but of course, just double check that when you are performing searches, that you are double checking the search parameters to make sure that you are getting the right results. Underneath that, I can search by project name. I can also search by status or by a specific member. I'm going to select search to just simply view all of the expense reimbursements that I have so far. So let's talk about what we're seeing in our search results. We have the date, of course, on the left-hand side of your screen, followed by who submitted that particular expense reimbursement request, the title, and of course, the title is being entered by the member, the subgroup that that expense applies to, the project. So you'll see here that these are the projects that are being chosen by the member. And we also have some extra projects that were added in as an ad hoc title. So these are things that were not associated with an event. They were simply project names that the member entered in themselves, followed by the status of each of those expenses. So let's talk about the statuses that you're seeing so far. Pending is the first status that you might see. It is a draft request. The submitted requests are those which have been submitted, have not been paid, and are awaiting approval. So we have our pending requests, which are drafts, followed by our submitted requests, which are awaiting approval. As far as the approval process, we have a handful of things in place to ensure that expenses are not getting reimbursed without several sets of eyes on them before that check or that credit actually goes out to the member. So we have 2 different levels of approval that occur before the expense can actually be reimbursed. Let's take a look at one of the items that are currently submitted but have not yet been reimbursed. We have a charge or an expense reimbursement request from August 11th from Jenny Cho. And it looks like she purchased some Adobe software and she would like to get reimbursed for that. We see that that particular line item has been submitted. We can view that particular expense request by clicking that eyeball icon and see just the very basic information that Jenny has entered, as well as view the receipt that she uploaded. Now, let's go ahead and go back to that reimbursement approval screen and take a look at how our screen changes when we select that checkmark icon. That checkmark icon is going to take us to the approval screen. It won't approve the expense reimbursement. It will take us to the screen where we approve the expense reimbursement. So at the very top, again, I'm seeing the exact same information. My difference here, though, is that I'm now actually able to edit the amount that's been approved. So when we were looking at Colleen's expenses, we did see one of the line items had a separate claim amount versus an approved amount. This is where that would come into play. Your approval process is an approval by one person initially, where they approve the expense. The second stage is actually reimbursing those funds to the member. The only time that you are able to edit the amount that is being approved is at this stage. So this is the point at which you would be reviewing the receipt, double checking that they've entered in the right amount, that they are asking to be reimbursed for proper items, and you're able to change the amount. So let's just say that I took a look at one of the options and it looks like Jenny purchased an additional item that maybe she isn't using for work purposes, and we're not going to reimburse her for that. So I can go in and I can edit this amount and I can say that we're only going to reimburse her for part of the charge as opposed to the full charge. I can also enter in some notes. So I have the ability to enter in notes that Jenny is able to see, that future treasurers are able to see. So they're able to see any notes that you put into this particular box. Now I can approve this expense. I can approve it as it is with my edited amount. I could have approved it as it was with my unedited amount as well. Or I can reject the expense. So if I edit the amount and approve it, Of course, Jenny is going to see that the expense has been approved. If I approve it as is without editing the amount, Jenny still gets an email letting her know that the expense reimbursement has been approved. If you reject the request, you can state in the notes why that request has been rejected. Maybe the member forgot to upload the receipts. You can reject it for any other reason. And in that case, the expense reimbursement request is going to be submitted back to Jenny for correction. And Jenny will, of course, get an email letting her know that that particular expense reimbursement request has been denied. So let's go ahead and approve this, and we'll talk about the approval process. So for security purposes, a couple of things to note. I'm logged in as Martin Smith, but Martin Smith cannot approve his own expense reimbursements. So Martin Smith has a handful of expense reimbursements listed at the very top of our screen here. And you see an approval icon. However, you don't see any buttons at the very bottom of your screen allowing you to approve or deny that request. If your treasurer or anyone who is using expense reimbursements is anticipating having their own expenses, they're going to need another person to go in and approve those. So again, for those security purposes, we do not allow one member to be able to approve their own expense reimbursements. Once we've approved for the first time, and I mentioned that there are 2 phases to the approval process, we see that our status has changed here. We now have a status instead of submitted, we have a status of approved-1. So that was your first stage of approval. That is where you are determining the amount that has been approved and basically whether it's been approved or denied. So if I go ahead and select this line item, I can still view that expense and I get a new icon that's available to me. I can select the pay option and now I have a slightly different screen. So I can still preview that expense. I can still view some additional information up top as my second set of eyes. I am looking now at the title, the amount claimed and approved, who the expense was submitted by, and who approved it on the first round. Now, we do not expressly state that a separate person has to perform both stages of approval. Martin Smith approved the expense the first time, set the amount, and Martin Smith can go in here and issue a check. You personally could say that first approvals always happen by one person, second approvals and creation of the check happen from another person. So those are just some internal best practices that you can develop, but we do have parameters in place that require 2 sets of approvals before that expense is actually reimbursed. So I can enter in some individual payment notes within this particular section. Those payment notes, of course, are going to be visible to everyone. I can enter in the date that I am going to pay Jenny. Now, right here on this particular screen, it's basically assuming that what you're going to do is send Jenny a check, which is completely fine. If you as an organization have decided that you want to be able to mail checks to your members to reimburse them for expenses, that's your prerogative. We'll go ahead and enter in a check number. Now, another option that you might want to consider is instead of physically cutting a check, mailing it out to the member, going to the post office, you might want to consider just adding a credit to your member's account. So instead of saying, I am going to issue check number 456 to Jenny, I could back out of this and say credited. So I can say that the check or the amount has been credited to that particular member's account. And I can save my changes. And now the next step in that case would be to go into the control panel and visit our people manager in the people tab. And there are several other ways that you can issue a credit to a member's profile. We have other webinars that discuss credits and payments and transactions. So if you are interested in learning more about issuing credits to a member or payments or transactions, please take a look at some of the webinars that we have on our YouTube channel. But for now, we're going to use the people manager to search for Jenny Cho. And we are going to go ahead and submit our credit to her account by selecting that charge credit icon, saying that this is a credit. And we then get to choose the credit type. So I will say that our credit is going to be for services. We'll call it our $300 charge. And we can say that this is for her expense reimbursement for her Adobe suite. We label it with our financial account. We'll call this education fees because she was using it to help out some of our other members. And we'll save our changes. And so now when Jenny visits her member profile, she can see that credit listed on her account. She can use that credit for anything across your website. Jenny can decide to save that credit and use it when it is time to renew her membership. She can use it to register for an event. She could, of course, just give it right back to your organization as a donation. So those are a couple of different ways that you can reimburse your members. Now, let's talk about a handful of other things within our expense reimbursements. So we went through the process of approving an expense reimbursement request and actually reimbursing the member. We looked at how simple it is to simply say that you're sending a check out to the member, and of course, how you can not leave your desk and reimburse the member using a credit to their member account. Let's take a look at what it's like to perhaps deny an expense. So we had Colleen who just submitted an expense request for the veggie tray for her committee meeting. So if I take a look at that particular line item, it is submitted. So we do have the ability to preview it, and we also have the ability to approve or deny it. So if I take a look at this expense reimbursement, maybe I'm taking a look at this and I've decided we're not going to reimburse Colleen, or, perhaps she spent more on the item than was previously approved. Maybe she forgot to upload a receipt. So instead of approving it, I am simply going to reject the expense request. So what will happen now is Colleen will have gotten an email letting her know that that particular expense had been rejected. And when I take a look at my list of expenses, I can see that the status of that expense is currently rejected, and I can still preview it. Now, let's pop very quickly back into Colleen's profile. So again, Colleen is logged in here. We're taking a look at her expense reimbursements. I'll go ahead and refresh this page very quickly. And so now we can see that that last line item, the veggie tray that Colleen submitted, has been rejected. And she immediately has the ability to go back into that item and edit it. So if I'm taking a look at this, perhaps I have been instructed to add an additional line item. Maybe I've been instructed to recategorize my expense. I can take a look at the notes to see if the administrator has submitted any notes as part of that process. And I can change my expense and hopefully get it approved a second time. We've taken a look at what expense reimbursements look like from the member's perspective, and we've talked about some of the additional items to take note of when you're developing your internal best practices. One thing that I did forget to mention is that between those two approvals, remember that we have approval number one, where you are determining the amount that gets actually reimbursed to the member and whether or not it is approved or denied. The second approval is when you're actually cutting that check or submitting that credit to the member. Between those two approvals, an email will go to the treasurer, letting them know that there is an expense that has been approved and requires payment. So those are a handful of things to think about when you are thinking about your best practices and how you can sort of structure your expense reimbursement process. Let's go ahead and review the items that we have talked about today. So we have had a demonstration of the setup. We've talked about categorizing our expense types, setting up events for expenses. We did talk about setting up an event in the future to use as a catch-all. We can also, of course, set up categories so that your members are submitting expense reimbursement requests in an organized fashion. And we talked about some of those internal best practice tips. We also looked at our members submitting requests, choosing a project, submitting documents, and editing requests should they get denied. And the last, of course, that we went through was our approval process. So remember that our approval process is 2 phases, and that administrators that are logged in cannot approve their own expenses. So we have that 2-stage approval process. We are able to view who has made that first approval. So there's always a breadcrumb trail of who has been managing those expenses. And then we also talked about your options for reimbursement, either cutting your members a check or crediting their member account. Devin, how are we doing on questions?
We're doing pretty well. I think we just got our first question about from Deborah about how to define the first person to make that approval. I believe any administrator can make the first approval. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. So any administrator or coordinator who has access to expense reimbursements would be able to go into expense reimbursements and make those approvals. So if you have a specific person or group of people in mind to act as that first stage of approval, that would be one of those internal best practices that you would set up.
Can you require there to be more than one approval before the payment option is available?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, you can't. So there is one approval that happens before the check is actually paid or before that payment option is available. But we can certainly add that as an option to add to our developers wish list.
And there was also one question about what type of reports. I think it's just one bulk export. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So we have one export that is available that will allow you to export either the request with line item details or payment details. And these requests include all of the information that you see, as well as notes that have been entered and who has submitted each of those approvals. So you'll see the person who submitted approval number 1 as well as approval number 2, which would be the payment. Expense reimbursements is available as an extra cost feature. The extra cost feature is a one-time fee of $600. If you are interested in obtaining expense reimbursements for your website, it is a quick call to our customer success team to let them know that you are interested. You can call us or you can email us at the same number that you would normally use to ask questions or get help. You let us know that, we activate the module on your back end, and you are up and running.
And then I've got one more question here. Someone asked to see if we could take a look at what the export looks like. I believe it should just run as an Excel CSV file.
We'll go ahead and run an export. So I'm going to open this up. It's going to download to wherever your downloads appear based on the browser that you're using. Mine opened up on a separate window. So we'll go ahead and view this option. It is just a CSV file, so we get some reimbursement details as well as reimbursement IDs. And we have all of the information, including who submitted the item, who approved those items. So we can see all of the approvers that we have for approval 1, approval 2, and we'll scroll over to see some additional payment information associated with the member who submitted that expense request. Well, that is all that I have for everyone today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next webinar. Bye, everyone.